Welcome to Holland's Hidden Heroes, the podcast where amazing stories from Dutch history come to life. In every episode, you hear about real people who made brave choices during scary and difficult times. I'm Lilian, and with me is my brilliant 11-year-old co-host Colin. In today's episode, we're diving deeper into what it meant to work in aviation back then. We'll explore the lives of two remarkable KLM England Voyagers. Along the way, we'll uncover the surprising role of carrier pigeons during the Second World War. And finally, we'll take a closer look at the Air Transport Auxiliary. So buckle up and let's embark on part 2 of the England Voyages of the Royal Dutch Airlines.
We are now at the Aviodrome, the aviation museum in the Netherlands. And this is our first field trip for the podcast, so I'm quite excited about it. And Colin, you've already learned a lot. When was KLM founded?
KLM, the Royal Dutch Airlines, was founded on October 7, 1919 in The Hague. It was the oldest airline in the world that still uses its original name. The first flight was on May 17, 1920, from London to Amsterdam. Queen Wilhelmina gave KLM the title Royal when it was founded.
So it's over 100 years old, KLM. That's pretty old. That's why we've seen all the old planes. But it was very dangerous to fly, wasn't it? And why was that?
It was very dangerous because there was no pressurized cabin, so they had to fly very low.
Yeah, and that had a huge impact. Because everything with the weather, whether it was raining and storming, they had a lot of turbulence. And sometimes they needed to land in muddy fields, and the locals needed to help out to push the planes forward. There were no fancy gadgets for the pilots, so they just had a map, a compass, and of course their courage. And the weather they had to do with predictions and then hope for the best. And they flew a different kind of planes. You tell what we just saw in the museum?
There's a Douglas DC-2 that looks like the famous,
like the uiver, which means stork, because KLM gave all its planes a bird name.
It's not the real stork, but it's a real DC-2 airplane. It has been painted in the original KLM colors to look like the stork, which became famous for flying in the McRobertson Air Race from London to Melbourne in 1934. This plane is one of the last DC-2s in the world that can still fly.
Yeah, that's quite impressive. And we've been inside this plane. It was quite small. And we had a little bit of an impression how it was to work for Trix in such an environment. Because she was one of the first flight attendants, which back then was called an air hostess. And they needed to bring their own picnic baskets and their own thermal flasks to help out the people who got on board. And how many people could be in the Douglas? How many seats do they have?
Around 14 to 16 seats.
Yeah, so that compared to the planes now, that is not so much. But it was still dangerous because sometimes the planes crashed or they needed repair maintenance. So there was usually also an engineer on board that traveled along. And if they needed repairment, they would just land somewhere in a meadow or somewhere on the street and then repair the plane and then continue. So it took much longer. The flight. Sometimes it took 2 or 3 days because they needed to stop. And the first flight from here to Batavia, which is now Jakarta, took 55 days. Well, we don't have flights like that anymore, do we? So we also visit the replica of the Schiphol building, which is a replica from 1928. And Trix started in 1935. So I think it's safe to say that Schiphol looked like this. And they have all these chalkboards where they wrote the routes and the departure and the arrivals. So it's not like now, everything is now computer managed. Well, that wasn't back then. It was all done by hand. And we also saw some suitcases, which are quite different from today too. So no wheelies under the suitcase. It was definitely different than it is now, which gives us a better image on the KLM staff and how they worked here. I'm now at the central station at The Hague, and Colin's got a school day. But I just visited our National Archive and I made an interesting discovery. Apparently Trix had a successor and his name was Ger van der Weert. And he also worked at KLM. So he's definitely someone to check out and to see what his story is. And I found out that Ida Veldhuizen van Santen, another air hostess, was also one of the England Voyagers that worked at KLM. So I'm now heading to our Royal Library because Ida wrote several diaries, which has all been bundled in one book years and years ago. So the book isn't available in any bookstore anymore, but it is still at our Royal Library, where I'm heading towards now. Let's see what we can find out.
We're now back at our podcast studio, well, actually our room at home, where we record this podcast. And it was quite nice to have a field trip, and we did some desk research, as you might have heard, in the National Archives and The Hague. So I think we picked two wonderful stories, which we will dive into in a second. There were also other KLM staff who made it to England. And there were multiple pilots like Adriaan Verhully and Pieter Zwarte and Theo van der Wulp and many others who eventually joined the RAF and flew for the Air Force in Britain. And because most KLM pilots joined a military training, which came to very useful to be in the Second World War. So let's dive into those two extraordinary stories. Shall we start with Ger, Colin?
Yes.
Okay. So Ger van der Weert, he was an engineer at KLM. And back in those days, the engineers also traveled along in the airplanes. Because it broke down so many times during their trip that it was necessary that there was always an engineer present. When the war broke out in the Netherlands, he lost his job. And he worked for a while for the Central Service for Import and Export. Well, actually, that was cover, because he used that job to gather a very secretive information, important information for the Allied military. Like the Germans' weaponry, where it was stored and where they transported it to. So he worked for the Dutch resistance. But he was very keen on getting to England. He very much wanted to escape our country and see if he could fight from there. So he made an effort by boat, but he was captured by the Germans. But because he was very clever, he was able to convince them that he wasn't traveling to England at all, but he was traveling to parts of the world where KLM still flew, even though he didn't have a job there anymore. But they believed him in the end, so they released him. And then he decided to go by land, and he had a trip completely on his own, one of the England Voyagers who succeeded to get to Britain on his own. But when he arrived in Spain, he first walked through the Pyrenees, and he was dressed up as an office clerk. So he pretended he was going to his job. That's how he switched from train to train, into Belgium, into France. And eventually he walked to Spain. And in Spain he was captured by the authorities and he was put into a concentration camp, which was horrible because he spent there months. And it was luckily that someone else from the Netherlands was able to help him out. And finally he arrived in London. He also underwent the interrogation of the patriotic school in the Dutch government. And then the spy training, the same one that Trix has got, because he was also recruited by the MI9, Room 900. And Colin, you've looked into it, because MI9 wasn't the Secret Service that provided the training, but it was the SOE.
It was a secret British group during World War II. They did spying, sabotage, and helped resistance fighters in countries taken over by the enemy, like the Netherlands, France, and Belgium. So, when people say SOE, they mean the special British team that worked behind enemy lines to fight against the Germans.
Yeah, and once his training was finished, he was ready to become a secret agent. And he was also parachuted back in the Netherlands. And he decided he didn't want to have a welcome committee, because they all knew what sometimes happened to secret agents, like it happened to Trix, that it were Germans instead of Dutch people. So he decided he wanted to land on his own and then figure his way out. So he did. But they didn't know that there were many Germans at the moment on the ground when he wanted to land. So his parachute just passed them by and they started to look for him. And he saw a bit of a ditch where he hid, and he covered himself with sand and leaves for 5 hours while the Germans were looking for him. So he could hear their footsteps, he could hear them talking, and he had to keep very, very quiet. So after those hours they gave up. So Ger carried 2 carrier pigeons with him in a carton box that was strapped around his chest. And I didn't know that, and I don't know if you knew that, Colin, that carrier pigeons were used in the Second World War. So I thought it was very interesting to look into, and you've done some research on them. Can you share a bit to the listeners what you've discovered?
Yes, so carrier pigeons were very important in World War II, especially when radios were unreliable or dangerous to use. There were a few steps to train pigeons. So training started young because they get used to their home base, their cage. They learn flying in steps, starting with shorter routes, and they get longer every time. They got to know their environment by the landscape, sunlight, magnetic fields, and scent. There was no way back. They could just fly in one way. They could only fly home. Carrier pigeons were used by armies, the resistance, and even by spies. Soldiers put messages on the carrier pigeon's leg. They were dropped with containers with pen, papers, and instructions. And they were like drones in the 1914s, as they used the carrier pigeons with mini cameras to make pictures during flight.
Oh, I really didn't know that. Did you?
No?
I didn't know they used them in the Second World War and not for these things. So this is very good. Did you discover anything else on the carrier pigeons?
Yes. Around 250,000 carrier pigeons were used by the Allies. The British Army had a special unit, National Pigeon Service. There were even some famous carrier pigeons.
They were celebrity pigeons.
Yes. For example, Cher Ami. This brave little pigeon flew through gunfire to deliver a life-saving message, even after being shot and badly injured. Thanks to Cher Ami, an entire battalion was rescued. And G.I. Joe. With just minutes to spare, G.I. Joe flew over 20 miles to deliver a crucial message that stopped a bombing. His speedy flight saved over 1,000 soldiers from friendly fire.
Oh, but this is very impressive. I really didn't know that. That's quite some information. And Gera carried 2 pigeons with him. And when I looked into the archives, because the department, room 900, where he worked for, which was very secretive, but they always reported to the Dutch government to let them know how their people were doing. And they wrote a letter to the Dutch government telling them that 1 pigeon had arrived. So it was very successful because his message that he has arrived and landed safely was sent to London successfully. So that's very good. So thank you for looking all into. That's quite interesting to do, or not?
Yes.
Yeah, to find us pigeons like G.I. Joe. Quite a name. So when Ger escaped from the Germans, which he was very lucky to do so, he got connected with several Dutch resistance groups, and he worked with them and he set up pilot escape lines. And it was very, very good that he did it in time, because there was a big operation, Market Garden operation, where a lot of Allied forces landed in the Netherlands by parachute. So very, very tough battle. And so a lot of military had to use the escape lines that Ger had set up. So that was very good that he managed to do that in time. And after the war, he was rewarded with multiple medals.
It was a very dangerous job. Roughly 100 to 120 Dutch agents were involved in SOE operations. Additional Dutch individuals worked with MI6. British Secret Intelligence Service, for information gathering and support roles. Of these, many were arrested or killed, and only a portion survived the war.
So I think it was very lucky for Ger to survive, but also for Trix, even though she's been captured in concentration camps. Then the last story of the England Voyagers of the Royal Dutch Airlines, the story of Ida Veldhuizen van Santen. She was another air hostess. She was a direct colleague from Trix, and she was a very, very brave woman. She traveled to many countries, like China and Japan, who were even at war back then, and she traveled all on her own. She was very adventurous. She had one big dream to become a pilot. But back in those days, it wasn't possible for a woman to have a pilot job. So she settled for the second best, air hostess. But before she was hired, she followed everything from the KLM. She followed them to radio, magazines, and newspapers, because the pilots and air hostess back then were like celebrities. They handed out autographs, people were cheering them and waiting for them at the airport, so Trix was already famous, and Ida could follow their stories. And then finally she made it, and she also became an air hostess. She was extremely happy. But then the war broke out. And like others, she had no job at the KLM anymore, and she very much wanted to flee and get to Britain and fight against the Nazi Germans from there. But she was a bit lost on what to do, and then when she secretly listened to the BBC radio, they get that there was a female pilot team, and they were looking for other female pilots to join in, and then she immediately knew she had to be there. So she also had a very dangerous route overland to get to England, and then she finally made it to London. And when she came to London, she applied at the Air Transport Auxiliary, the ATA. So Colin, can you explain what the ATA is?
The ATA was a British group in World War II. It started in 1939. Pilots in the ATA moved planes from factories to military places. They did not fight, but their work was still dangerous. The ATA was one of the first groups to let women be pilots. About 166 women flew planes. Later, they got the same pay as men, which was very rare at that time. People sometimes called them Ada girls. There were 25 women from other countries in the ATA. They came from the United States of America, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, Poland, and the Netherlands. There were two other Dutch women in the ATA, Marga van Arnhem and Sophie Marie Zijlstra. They flew many different planes with little training. Very brave.
Yeah, they were very brave. Indeed, they were. But it was a very, very dangerous position to be in. So can you tell a bit about the dangers they had to encounter?
Like I said, pilots of the ADA did not fight, but their work was still dangerous. They had to fly in rain, fog, snow, and wind with no radar to help them see. It was easy to get lost or crash. They had no guns or protection. If enemy planes saw them, they could not fight back. Sometimes they had to fly planes that were damaged or not tested yet. The planes could break in the air. Pilots had to fly over 100 types of aircraft. They got very little training for each type. Some planes were fast fighters, others were big bombers. They usually flew alone, without a co-pilot or radio. If something went wrong, they had no help. Sometimes they flew near places where the enemy could shoot them down. Also, barrage balloons were a danger. These were big balloons tied to the ground with long steel cables. They were used to stop enemy planes from flying low, but ADA pilots also had to fly near them, especially when landing or taking off. The cables were hard to see, and hitting one could cause a crash, so pilots had to be very careful flying around them.
Whoa, that is impressive. Because the British tried to protect their own factories by having all these barrage balloons. Very, very impressive lady. So I think we're coming at the end of our first story. We had three very interesting people we looked into. I think it's important that we learn about the sacrifices those people made and the bravery they showed. And they all did it so we can still live in freedom today. Our democracy is here because people were so brave to fight off the Nazis. And these three are very exceptional. So I think it's important that we pass on these stories. Before you know, they're kind of lost in history. And what did you like about researching and looking into these stories?
I learned new things, and I liked the field trip we did today. Thank you for listening. We hope you have enjoyed our first story. If you did, please give us a like on our socials or a rating on Spotify or other platforms.
Yes, and don't forget to follow us to know more about the upcoming podcast, as we hopefully will discover more interesting stories, one needed hero at a time.